I wasn't a captain, hardly even a lieutenant. I might have been a private in the rear ranks, a congressman with, how many, 4 terms under his belt. But I was a joyful part of President Kennedy's team. I believed in such things as the Peace Corps and the Job Corps and the other things that Kennedy had launched. I wanted to be a part of bringing them to pass. And when I was told that he was contemplating a trip to Texas in November of, I guess I was told 6 weeks earlier, I got together with all the people who would be involved. We planned the itinerary in such a way that he would go to San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, Austin. He was in Fort Worth the last night of his life, and of course made his last 2 speeches here in Fort Worth. My job was to do 2 things. First, to arrange the itinerary for Fort Worth, and secondly, to try to help John Connally raise enough money for the big fundraiser that was to be held on the night of November 22nd in Austin. Fundraising never had been my forte and never was all the time I stayed in Congress. I didn't enjoy it. To me, fundraising was the crabgrass in the lawn of political life. I didn't like it. Hated to ask people for money. Connally was a little more practical than I. He said, Jim, this is the purpose. We've got to have some money, as you know, to conduct a viable campaign next year. And I want you to help me raise $100,000 out of North Central and West Texas. So I got on the phone. I got together with some people in little groups and meetings, and I think probably I raised maybe $87,000, which in that time was a substantial amount of money. I was working on the $100,000. I'm not sure that I made that. I think that was my quota, and I'm not sure that I fulfilled it. However, I insisted, this was my insistence, that we have a meeting outside early in the morning, before the meeting of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce group in the Texas Hotel on the mezzanine floor in the big ballroom. Those tickets, of course, were limited. The seating it was a big ballroom, but even so, you could accommodate only so many people. And I carefully worked with Raymond Buck, who was my friend and president of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. And by this time, Amon Carter Jr. was a good friend of mine. And I worked with what powers that be in Fort Worth to put on a good, effective breakfast meeting of the civic, business, and commercial leadership of the community. We integrated it. We had representatives of labor unions as well as of the professions and of the large businesses. We had black and Hispanic representatives there as well. And we tried to create a good cross-section of the civic leadership of our community. But even so, gosh, in those days it was rare when the President of the United States was in your town, your hometown. There had not been a sitting president in Fort Worth since 1936, when Franklin D. Roosevelt had taken a ride down Main Street in an open touring car. I was there as a boy. I had stood on the sidelines and seen him, waved and just walking on cloud 9 simply to get a glimpse of the president. I knew there were thousands of people, plain people, ordinary folks, who loved John F. Kennedy, whose president he was, many of whom had worked in his campaign, many of whom had done the mundane, thankless tasks of wearing out their shoe leather and knocking on doors and helping him to carry Texas, which he and Johnson had done, who would love to see the president. So I imposed upon the others, and I said, look, in my hometown, I want a public meeting. I want a meeting out there. We can go right outside the Texas Hotel where he'll be spending the night. We will assemble the crowd in that big parking lot out there. In those days, before they had built the park, which now commemorates that tragic day, there was ample space for maybe 8,000, 10,000 people crowded out into the streets in all directions, maybe more. And they were crowded. I want everybody to be able to come. Folks who have to punch a clock, let's say at 8 o'clock, they could be there at 7. So we set an early morning appearance, to which Kennedy readily agreed. Boy, the night before, it rained. I awakened at about 4:30 and a patter of raindrops. I couldn't go back to sleep. Every 10 minutes, I'd go over to the window to look out. I was staying at the hotel, so as to be there to get the president and take him out to meet the crowd. Rain was still falling. Finally, at about 15 minutes before he was scheduled to appear, I looked out and people were already gathering in rain gear, some with umbrellas, many with umbrellas. And I thought, oh, what a mess, what a tragedy. I've got the president, what have I got him into? He's got to get up on that flatbed trailer and speak to that crowd in the rain. 15 minutes before we went out there, clouds disappeared, the sun came through, bright, beautiful, sunshiny day, rain disappeared. I thought, the luck of the Irish. So I went by to get him, and we all went out. There's a picture here of the day.
Appropriate time to show some of those photographs, I think.
Here we were walking outside, out of the hotel. There's Lyndon Johnson and Ralph Yarborough, and State Senator Don Kennard and I. All right.
Is that okay, Bob?
Yeah, that's fine.
And let's go ahead and point them out.
Tilt the top toward me a little bit. That's good.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Is that all right?
There was a reflection on it.
Here's
Now point out the
Senator Yarborough and I, President Kennedy, of course, Governor Connolly, Vice President Johnson. This is Rufus Youngblood, the Secret Service man, who threw himself over Lyndon Johnson's body when the shots came, and these here, another Secret Service man here, and our crowd moved out of the hotel out to a big crowd that was waiting for us in the parking lot.
Welcome to Fort Worth.
Welcome to Fort Worth. Yeah.
The sign there, suppose.
We see it.
We came out there, and what a crowd it was. Yeah. There's one picture of the crowd.
Let's take that over here too.
Looking in one direction while the president is speaking.
There's still some umbrellas up over here.
Oh yeah. Here is another picture shown from another vantage point. You can see people crowding in the streets, right up against the corners of the buildings across the streets in this direction.
Here you are. Here's Speaker Wright, right? Right. That's you, is it not?
That young and tender-looking guy with the bushy eyebrows is I. Here's a kind of a close-up of that picture. I was so happy. I can't tell you how ebullient I was to have the President of the United States in my hometown, talking to my constituents, my folks. I was just overcome with joy. Here he spoke. This is probably as good a picture of.
Is the glare okay, Bob?
Yes.
Here's President Kennedy speaking. Raymond Buck, who was the President of the Chamber of Commerce. Here I am. Senator Yarborough, Governor Connolly, President Johnson, the Secret Service man, ubiquitously down front, scanning the crowd. No foolishness to him, all serious business. This was a State Democratic Executive Committee woman, Mrs. David O. Ballou, Marjorie Ballou. Her husband, David, later became federal district judge some 15 or more years later. These were happy days. This was the night before when they had arrived at Carswell Air Force Base. You can see it's dark, and someone had a bouquet of roses to give to Jacqueline Kennedy. Those were yellow roses, and she took them and had them with her that night in the hotel. You see here Governor Connolly and Nellie Connolly, and
There you are.
there I am, Ralph Yarborough. Back here is Graham Purcell, Congressman from Wichita Falls, who was with us that day. Here is David Ballou, whom I mentioned, later a federal judge. Over here in the corner is Albert Thomas. The evening just before we left Houston, we had dedicated a federal building in his honor in Houston, Texas, and the president had spoken there.
Go ahead, Bob.
You started with the party in '63, coming to Texas in Washington?
Yes.
Okay.
You were on Air Force One.
Yes, along with others in our delegation, there were a number of us who left Washington on Air Force One to fly to Texas the previous day on November 21st.
What was the feeling? What was the atmosphere coming to Texas? Did you get to talk to President Kennedy during that trip?
Yes, oh gosh, yes. I talked with him more, of course, on the route from Fort Worth over to Dallas. President Kennedy really was absorbed with the consuming interest in how these two cities, Fort Worth and Dallas, so close together, were yet so utterly different in personality and in makeup.
And you and he discussed this?
Oh, yes. He and I and John Connolly had a discussion on Air Force One from Fort Worth over to Dallas that morning of November 22nd. There had appeared in the Dallas News that morning a scurrilous ad calling him a traitor and other unflattering things.
You'd seen that?
Yes, he had seen that. And I was irate. I thought it was a damned inhospitable thing to allow that the paper should have screened it out. I don't know what I was right or not, but
How did he approach you on that? I mean, did he...
he didn't approach me. I don't remember how the subject came up, but he was puzzled as to how to approach the Dallas News, how to be friends with them. They had written other unkind things. Mr. Dealey had written an unkind editorial about him, saying he ought to be riding Carolyn's tricycle or something like that. And we were trying to describe to him the different cultural history of our two towns. That Fort Worth was more of a blue-collar town, founded on cattle, wheat, cotton, railroads. That Dallas was a white-collar town, founded on banks, insurance companies, things of that sort. And I think he was fascinated by the comparison of the two. And I'm not sure if John and I were sociologists enough to give him a good understanding, but we did the best we could.
John Connolly, you mean?
Yeah. We did the best we could. I suppose that was the happiest and the saddest day of my life.
Let me,
up to
before
that
we
time.
get to that, but let's go back to the Air Force One trip from Washington down.
Yeah.
Was there anticipation? Was there some consideration? You know, Adlai Stevenson had been attacked in Dallas about 1 month before. Was that discussed either among the news people or among your colleagues? Or?
Wes, I can't say what may have been discussed among the news people because I really didn't have that much access to them. I was not a prime target of their queries until they started for Fort Worth, and then they peppered me with a multitude of questions about Fort Worth, our plans for the president's visit. So I don't know what was in their minds. It was not a matter of great apprehension on our part. I had been with Johnson and Kennedy on the day he had visited Fort Worth and Dallas in the 1960 campaign, had ridden in the parade midday through Dallas, deliberately timed for the noon hour so as to get a big overflow of people out there, And I had seen that there was not a lot of applause, not a lot of smiles.
You're talking 1960.
1960.
Right.
And I had some personal question in my mind as to how warmly he might be received in Dallas. I didn't have any question how warmly he would be received in Fort Worth. But I wondered about Dallas. I needn't have. God, it was wonderful. It was gracious. It was warm. When he did get there, I know I'm getting ahead of the story.
Okay. No, that's okay. We're there now.
By the time we got to Dallas, and he opted for this open touring car, Secret Service tried to convince him to use a bubble-top limousine, which they had prepared for him there because of the safety precautions, security. He turned it down. John F. Kennedy made the judgment.
Did you hear this?
Yes, yes. He wanted to demonstrate his confidence and his faith in the people of Dallas and to be part of them, to share with them, to see them, to be seen by them, to look in their eyes, to wave at them. I don't know. We were in the 5th or 6th car back in Dallas, behind the press bus and press cameraman. Jack Brooks and Earl Cabell and I believe, were in this car together.
Earl Cabell, then mayor of Dallas.
Then, having been mayor, then mayor of Dallas.
Yes.
I believe that is correct. Yeah, it surely is. We were just overjoyed by the marvelously hospitable turnout of people all the way from Love Field, all the way in through the city streets, down Main Street, and then when we turned there at the courthouse,
Houston,
going north, we were in such a good mood. I heard the first shot. I thought it sounded like a rifle shot, but I couldn't imagine. So incongruous to me was the idea that there'd be a rifle shot. Then I heard the second shot. And I thought, it was crazy. Someone is trying to fire a 21-gun salute with a rifle. It was obviously a rifle shot. And obviously the shots were from the same rifle. Anybody who's hunted knows how to recognize the sound of a rifle. And then the third shot came.
You
The cadence.
distinctly heard these 3 shots?
Yes. I distinctly heard 3 shots. That's all I heard. Now, this is not to say there couldn't have been some other gun with a silencer. I don't know that. I'm not authoritative on that. But I must say the audible shots were 3, and they were from the same rifle. Same rifle. But the timing of the third, the cadence, was just off a fraction of a second, enough to let me know, uh-oh, no, this isn't a salute. And then there was pandemonium as we turned heading west and past that. We looked and saw pandemonium in the cars, and Jacqueline Kennedy on her knees in the back seat, looking out behind, and we couldn't imagine what was happening. Then the car shot forward. Immediately after that, the car in which the vice president had been riding shot forward, and as we picked up speed to follow in train. As we passed the crowd on the grassy knoll, the look of sheer horror in their faces told me that they had just witnessed a traumatic event.
On the faces of the people.
Of the people. The people standing there.
Been standing there.
In utter trauma.
Mrs.
Shock.
Cabell, you were in the car with Mrs. Cabell, who said she also smelled gunpowder. Do you recall that?
Mrs. Cabell,
Or was she in your car?
I'm not sure she was in my car. We talked later at the hospital. She had said that she saw someone.
And she said she saw someone.
Saw
yes.
someone on the 6th floor, as it turns out, of the book depository building with a rifle in his hand. I didn't see that. I didn't look there. I wasn't looking.
She did. You distinctly remember her telling you that?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Good.
Well, it wasn't at the time we were in the car. It was later
at
when we
Parkland.
arrived at Parkland.
Okay.
How would you describe then your emotions at that point? You were then speeding behind them toward
Yeah.
Parkland Hospital?
Yes.
What went through your mind? Were you convinced at that early juncture that there was a possibility the president had been shot?
I was convinced there was a probability that the president had been fired at, and possibility that he'd been shot. When we got there at Parkland, a group was carrying the president out and into the hospital on a stretcher. And I went and looked in the back seat of the car, and the blood was abundant, and the awful reality came upon me that President Kennedy had not only been shot, he'd been hit and badly wounded. Then, short minutes later, of course, we discovered the truth. It was, of course, an emotional time. I can't recall, but one other time during my time in Congress, when I had been so emotionally impacted by anything. That day for me was an emotional roller coaster. The morning beginning with such ebullient joy, and then ending with such unutterable pathos, such unspeakable sadness, that this person, this man that we admired so much, in the very bloom of his youth, cruelly plucked off by so senseless a deed. It staggered me, and I went around in a daze for some time. I'm talking about a period of not of hours, but of days.
But of those hours at Parkland, how would you describe the feeling and the feeling of the people there? You did not try to go inside Parkland.
Yeah, well, I did. Ultimately, I went in and spoke, had a few words with some who were in there, and Jack Brooks was in there with the. I went in to find out what had happened, and when we discovered what had happened, the advice came to Lyndon to leave, to get out, because it might be a conspiracy, and there might be gunmen, God knows where.
How did you hear about this, Mr. Speaker?
Well, I was there.
I mean, did you just talk in the groups?
The conversation had begun. I did not initiate it, nor participate in it, other than to stand there and in stony silence and traumatized.
But you heard the conversation?
Yes. And Jack Brooks said, you need to get out and get back to Washington. You need to be somebody said you need to be sworn in, you're president. Lyndon said who would swear me in. Jack Brooks is the one who recommended Judge Sarah Hughes, and we called Judge Sarah Hughes. Someone went and called, and she was there and agreed to meet Johnson and the others at Air Force One, and there we had him sworn in.
Before we get to that, did you hear that the president had died from a news conference, or did somebody tell you, or how did,
They told us there.
inside the hospital?
I don't know how many of us were there. There weren't many of us. Just a handful of us were there and heard that. And it came as such a shattering news to me. I went out and told some of the others, Purcell and some of the others. It was an awful moment. The group in Washington, the New Frontiersmen, someone said we'll never laugh again. No, I think someone said we'll never laugh again. And Larry O'Brien said, oh yes, we'll laugh again, but we'll never be young again. And I don't know, but for all of us that was true. I think it was true for me. I was, God, I don't know how old I was 40 years old, I think, at the time.
Mr. Speaker, Bob Huffaker, who was a reporter at KRLD at that time, interviewed you, and we think this is one of the more remarkable pieces of tape. And I asked you about it when we arranged this. You said you did not recall it.
I do not recall it.
The first voice is that of Bob Huffaker, and then obviously it'll be you. I'd like for you to listen to it, and then I want to get more of what your reaction was in terms of how you think it changed the country, the political aspect as well as the governmental part of the country. Here's that interview.
No one wants to say anything on an occasion like this, but someone must have something to say. We have here with us Fort Worth Congressman Jim Wright. Mr. Wright, do you have something to say? We have just learned that our president is dead. This is a sad day, a day of grief, a day of shame for this land. That anyone would hate, that anyone would seek to kill the President of the United States. We must strive anew to rebuild the hope. May merciful God console his loved ones and his family. May that same God bless this land that from this moment of such deep grief, we may rebuild in faith and not in fear, and in love and not in hate. I know the nation mourns and will deeply mourn those of us who were with him today when he was so alive, so brilliant, so outgoing, exposing himself to the public. Will never forget this experience and will always remember him as the president who went to the people, not fearing to expose himself, his person, his safety, his own repose, to his land and his people. It is tragic that in this free land anyone would so learn to hate in his heart that he would seek to take violently into his hands this kind of an act. But it has been done. There is still in this land the fiber to rebuild on a basis of respect for duly constituted authority, and we must do it. We must not panic. God bless you, Congressman Wright.
Do you recall that now after having heard it?
Yeah, I recall it now. I hadn't heard it from that day until now.
How has the country rebuilt completely? How did it change the country in your opinion?
For a little while, yeah, I think it set at rest the fevered hates that are fed by demagogues, some sincere perhaps, none of them good for the country, people who teach us to hate one another, teach us to despise and loathe people in authority. I can't improve on what I said that day. I'm amazed that I had the presence to be able to say those things, but as I listened back, my thoughts or the words I would express are no different than they were that day. I think for a little while we did restore in shame our lost respect for civil and duly constituted authority. We did in our grief draw together for long enough that the new president, Mr. Johnson, could lead us, and we would have enough respect for the institutions of our free society that we had a sense of compatibility and cooperation. And that's how things get done. I regret that that mood didn't endure, and maybe in the nature of human creatures it just isn't going to endure. Ultimately, somebody will come along and preach hate again, and fear again. And we see recurrences of that, and may God in His heaven grant that we don't have to have tragedies of this kind to bring us back to our senses from time to time.
I want to come back to the general feeling in the political process right now that there is a negative advertising and a meanness by the opponent toward the proponent and the proponent toward the opponent, so forth. But let's go back right now to Parkland Hospital. Do you recall where you went after this interview and after your, I presume you were out there on the outside of Parkland at that time?
Well, I went back to Washington and I went home and went home and was in a daze, really. I mean, in a state of shock. I remember the events, of course, the funeral, the service, the ceremony inside the rotunda.
You attended the entire funeral?
Oh, yeah. I did. And for some young people back in Fort Worth, I was given one of the shoes from the horse, the black riderless horse that marched in the parade.
You have that today?
No, I gave that to some people. I don't know where it is today. The long walk out to Arlington National Cemetery, the enormous throngs, crowd that cascaded out upon those lawns.
Were you a participant in the walk?
Oh, yes, yeah.
You and other members of Congress
Yes,
were behind?
yes, we walked. And stood there through the service. I remember little else except then later watching television when I was back at my office or back at home, whichever, and seeing President Johnson following that service, receiving all of the ambassadors and representatives. Charles de Gaulle was there, and the only two of the group I remember who were as tall as Johnson were Charles de Gaulle and Ambassador Dobrynin, who then was a new ambassador from the Soviet Union. He stayed on, I think, to be probably the longest, the dean of the Corps, perhaps. He stayed on until 1987, I guess. And when he was called back by Gorbachev to become a foreign minister.
You were keeping up with events, Oswald's arrest.
Yes.
What was going on, say, back in Dallas, from that standpoint.
Yes.
And where were you, say, when Jack Ruby shot Oswald on Sunday morning? Were you involved in the ceremonies, you recall?
I don't remember where I was. I saw the frequently repeated footage on television very soon after it had happened. And that was a stunning thing. Never before had an event, a murder, been witnessed by so many millions of people. I didn't know Jack Ruby and wasn't able to identify with his motives or anything about him. However, when they began trying to piece together the truth of it all, and President Johnson appointed the Warren Commission, the very best people of unimpeccable credentials from half Republicans, half Democrats. I began to think, since this Oswald was from Fort Worth, I wondered if I had ever heard from any of his family. We kept card files in those days. Anytime a person wrote to me, that fact would be entered on a card bearing that person's name, and these cards were filed alphabetically and color-coded for different types of problems they brought to me. Sure enough, we discovered that I had received, I don't know how much earlier, 18 months earlier or 2 years earlier, I had received a letter from the mother of Oswald. He, at the time, was in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and she had not heard from him, and she asked me to see if I could find her son, who was, now, I didn't know who he was, I didn't know who she was. She was a constituent.
Did she speak to you personally?
No, she wrote to me.
Oh, wrote
it was a letter, And I turned it over to our State Department, and they turned it over to the Russian, some internal people over there, and discovered and reported back that he, Oswald, had gone to the Russian authorities and tried to defect to the Soviet Union. Now, I didn't even remember this at the time, because it had been one of probably 100 similar problems I'd received that day. See, perhaps one of a couple of thousand I had received that month. Who knows? But we discovered, yes, we'd heard from her. And we had found out that he had gone to the Russians and wanted to defect to the Soviet Union, and they had not taken him up on that offer. But they said they would try to find him and get him to write to his mother. And I had received a letter telling me all of this, and had sent it to his mother, written to his mother, and said that they were trying to find him and get him to write to her. And I had forgotten about it, but someone on my staff remembered there was something about some guy over there. We found out, sure enough, we had heard from that very family.
Marguerite Oswald, the mother, was quoted in Jim Bishop's book, The Day Kennedy Was Shot, that the State Department had paid for her son's return to this country from Russia, and that you were aware of the arrangement. Were you aware of such an arrangement, or had you heard of such?
No, I wasn't aware the State Department paid for his coming back, although that may have been a consequence of the search for him. I doubt very much that the State Department did pay for his return, but it may have, I don't know.
Would that
this
be
is the first time
procedure?
I don't think so, but
You had not heard this?
no, I hadn't heard that. I sure hadn't. But it may have. There may be a procedure like that by which our embassies abroad will seek to repatriate American citizens who get over there and are destitute and can't get home. There may be such a provision even now, and if there isn't now, there might have been then. I'm sorry, I don't remember that detail, but that's an interesting thing.
Yeah. The Warren Commission report, you have pointed out that these were impeccable people with impeccable credentials who served on the Warren Commission. But as you well know, there are many people who've been critical that it was hurried to publication, that there were some inaccuracies. Did you feel that the Warren Commission report was correct? Do you think it was rushed too much? What is your view looking back on it this many years later?
It's easy in hindsight to criticize something that seemed perfectly logical at the time. I knew what was in President Johnson's mind. In fact, I knew the words he used because I had heard him in his appeal to Chief Justice Warren to accept the chairmanship of this commission.
What were the words?
He had said, "You don't understand, Mr. Chief Justice, your president is asking you to do this for your country." He was explaining that it was absolutely necessary that we get to the bottom of it. All sorts of rumors were floating throughout the country. It was a very dangerous kind of a situation, with rumors afloat and no direct information, little knowledge of what had gone on. And so Johnson felt the responsibility to find the truth and to imbue that truth with the authority of the very most respectable, most responsible, most authoritative figures in the American government, in a wholly bipartisan commission. He chose Gerald Ford, later to be president, then the Republican leader of the House, for example, as one of the members of that commission, and the Chief Justice, a Republican, as the chairman of the commission, and people like Hale Boggs, a Democratic leader in the House, and Democratic and Republican ambassadors to serve on this high-level blue ribbon commission. They took reams and reams of depositions. They developed a body of evidence, and the evidence available pointed, I think, rather conclusively to their conclusion that it had been the act of a single gunman. Now, I don't know if that's true. Lyndon Johnson himself expressed some suspicion that there might have been some Cuban involvement in retaliation for an attempt that had been made. I had not known about it, on the part of someone acting in behalf of the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro. Johnson thought the Cubans might have been trying to retaliate.
Did you personally hear him discuss this?
Yes, privately, not publicly. A small group of us. But he didn't know that to be the case. He had a sort of suspicion that it might possibly have been the case. Then it is conceivable. Still, you can look back and imagine a scenario in which there might have been a conspiracy. But it wasn't proven, and I think the bulk of the evidence indicated that Oswald, acting more or less on his own, had done this. I don't know. All I know is that I had confidence in the integrity of the people who composed the commission. And if they erred, or to the extent they might have been incomplete in the knowledge they unearthed, I'm certain that it wasn't an intentional cover-up. I'll just guarantee you they are not the character of people who would engage in a cover-up. The people who comprised that commission were as honorable and as decent as America has.
Did you see the Oliver Stone movie, JFK?
Yeah, I did.
Are you thinking about that as you say that?
Yes. Yes, I am.
What is your view of a movie or a publication such as this, under those circumstances?
Well, I think Oliver Stone had a fixation on the idea of there being a conspiracy of some sort. I think he relied too heavily upon the imagination of this district attorney in Garrison in New Orleans, who may, I think Garrison probably embellished his beliefs with imaginary conclusions. Maybe he had some knowledge of something, but the people I knew from New Orleans did not have a great deal of faith in him or in his stability. I don't know, but I think Garrison probably went a little bit overboard in that regard. Incidentally, I've seen Garrison's film on Nixon. And what I'm
Stone.
Oh, Stones. I'm sorry.
Yes,
I'm
okay,
sorry. I think
no.
Stone went overboard a little bit. I think Stone in this film on Nixon continues his fixation with the idea of a possible conspiracy, and imagines that Nixon himself knew about or was privy to, if not involved in, such a conspiracy. I don't think there's a shred of evidence to that effect. And to imply that so broadly in the movie, I think probably does former President Nixon an injustice.
The stigma that was placed upon Dallas immediately after and for quite some time after, and to some extent still today, for being partially responsible for the killing of the president. Did you receive that reaction when you went back to Washington from your colleagues in Congress? Or
Yes, from some.
can you give us an example?
Well, there arose among some of the people in Congress who were devoted to President Kennedy an outrage, and some of them tended to think of Texans as undecipherable people of a breed apart, and tended to affix upon all Texans the opprobrium of being gunmen or people who carried guns and were reckless and violent with the use of firearms. I don't think that's true. I didn't think it was true at the time, of course, and would defend Texans, notwithstanding the fact that the one who apparently one who did shoot the president was from Texas and went to Arlington Heights High School, which was only a few blocks from where my home at that time was in Fort Worth. It stunned me to think that our culture could produce anybody who would want to assassinate the president. Bear in mind that it had been a long while, in 1963, since an assassination attempt had been made upon a president. You'd have to go back from 1963 to 1933, maybe 30 years, in Miami, when an effort was made to shoot President Roosevelt, and the mayor of Miami, if I recall, was shot. I don't believe there had been any other attempt on the life of a president in the past 30 years. So it was stunning to us, almost unbelievable, incongruous that in the sublime scheme of things, people would be so insane as to anyone to try to want to assassinate the president. Now, of course, it set in motion a period in which many such outrages occurred, other assassination attempts and other assassinations. I'm sure that there were some people who tended to blame Texans and Dallas. Some people were angered that the Dallas News had run this column, or had run this ad, this advertisement calling for the president's not assassination, but impeachment.
Treason, yeah.
They're calling him guilty of treason. But when you stopped and analyzed the two, they were not related. Apparently Oswald was a leftist, apparently a person of communist inclination. The people who wrote the ad were right-wingers, 180 degrees on the ideological spectrum away from the ideology of Oswald. So I just think that these were happenstances. It was bad, and it is bad when people are taught to hate, and some people in our communities have been taught to hate.
You can order a videotaped copy of any of tonight's American Perspectives events by going online to the bottom of cspan.org's homepage and clicking on C-SPAN Store. Or call C-SPAN Archives toll-free weekdays at 1-877-ON-C-SPAN. That's 1-877-662-7726. Our look at oral histories of the JFK assassination continues now on American Perspectives with retired Secret Service agent Winston Lawson. He was in charge of security in Dallas and rode in the lead car in President Kennedy's motorcade. This interview, provided to us by the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, runs a little over an hour.
In the presidential detail that you were a part of, did you have a particular assignment, a particular duty?
Most regular agents on the detail are shift agents. They have shifts of 8 to 4, 4 to 12, and 12 to 8, all around the clock, depending on where the president is, and if the president is in the White House, you're stationed at the White House. If the president is on a trip, either overseas or to Dallas or wherever, the shifts go along. If the president is only going to be stopping in Dallas during the day, like he was, for example, in 1963, but overnighting someplace else, the 12 to 8 shift, the midnight shift, would not go to Dallas. They would go to wherever he was going to be staying overnight. And for example, he was going to be staying at the LBJ Ranch. So that midnight shift that got done in Fort Worth would have gone to the LBJ Ranch area, gone to Austin, and then be taken over to the ranch.
Did Mrs. Kennedy have her own separate agents?
Yes, and to this day, depending again on the president, the family, and so forth, there's the main detail for the president, and then there are these offshoot details. If the president has a wife, if he has children that are protectable and so forth, then there are these offshoot, smaller details that are involved. They're all part of the Presidential Protective Division, but if the wife and the children are someplace while he is at point A and he's at point B, well, of course they split.
Did Kennedy do a lot of fraternizing with the Secret Service agents?
Not really. He was pleasant to them. If you'd been around for a while, he knew who you were. And each president is different, believe me, just because of their personality or whatever. And you try, even to this day, not to get too familiar. You spoke when you were spoken to, unless there was a reason, for bringing something to their attention or something like that, or if there was a reason to talk to them. And each one is different. Each vice president, each president, some were friendlier than others, and some of them, because of their personalities or what was going on at the time.
Do you recall any particular anecdotes or stories that involve you and President Kennedy having any sort of exchange that you can recall for us here?
Yes, on his trip on President Kennedy's trip to Ireland, the summer before he was assassinated, that was the summer of 1963. He had a number of stops in Ireland, of course, over a couple of days. And one of the stops, he was in the mayor's office and so forth, council chambers, came out, and the crowds were just tremendous. And I think it was County Cork, but I'm not too sure. But it was one of his many stops. Of course, he had his limousine, but he also had that follow-up car, the famous follow-up car that was later, talked about quite a bit in the Dallas assassination. The one that had the running boards all the way across the side, the Cadillac, which we had 2 or 3 of them in those days. And he didn't want to ride in his regular car, so because of the crowds, he got into the follow-up car. And the crowds were practically right up to the running boards. And we had agents on the running boards, both on the left and on the right, and the driver and so forth. And President Kennedy and one or two other people were sometimes sitting, sometimes standing in the back seat. And as we slowly moved through the crowd, and they were people trying to reach in to touch him and all that, somebody hit me on the chest with their hand or their shoulder or something like that. And back I went with the, see, there was a, the door came up, oh, right about, not quite waist high, maybe buttocks high. And when they pushed me like that, it was just like a fulcrum. My feet went up and I landed on President Kennedy, who was sitting down at that particular time with my feet up in the air on my back, right on his lap. And he went, oof, and helped me get back up into my proper post. And there was a picture in the, that I have at home, as a matter of fact, and a little story in the newspaper about that in that city newspaper a day or so later. That's just one anecdote.
Did you like President Kennedy?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What about President Kennedy and his children? Did you ever see them together?
I saw them a lot. Saw them both at the White House and on weekends when they were either at Glenora in Virginia or at the new place that they just finished building like a couple of weeks before he was assassinated, or up in Hyannis or places like that. Yeah, they played together a lot, and he was a very good family man.
Did President Kennedy, to your knowledge, or did you hear him ever mention or talk about the possibility of some sort of violence coming to him or any type of assassination attempt?
Yes, and this is, I don't know what to call it, but I did an advance for President Kennedy in Buffalo and Niagara Falls. I believe it was 1962. President Kennedy was going to Buffalo, New York for the Polish Day Parade. So he landed in Niagara Falls at a Marine base that was adjacent to the Niagara Falls airport there. Took a motorcade to downtown Buffalo, went out a little ways and joined the parade that was already in progress. He joined it out maybe 20, 30 blocks from the city hall where it was going to terminate, and he was going to give a speech. I'm from the Buffalo area originally, in that area. And my parents and my aunt and uncle and my brother and his wife, I made arrangements for them to be part of the crowd in Niagara Falls. And after he arrived, went downtown Buffalo, was part of the parade near the end, gave the speech on the front steps of on a platform at the City Hall in Buffalo, and got back out to Niagara Falls. He walked the fence line like he did here in Dallas later, and like all presidents usually do, or vice presidents or whatever. And I didn't introduce my family to him, but one of the supervisors on the detail who was standing next to him said, words to the effect, Mr. President, this is Agent Lawson's family. And President Kennedy said, well, he must be doing a pretty good job because nobody has shot me yet. No, I mean, when you think of what happened a year later, I mean, to hear something like that is just mind-boggling.
Prior to what happened in Dallas, was there ever any incident where you felt like the president was in danger, or was there ever any incident where something had to be done to stop someone from doing anything?
Yes. There was a time in the Palm Beach area when someone was arrested down there that he was coming down there to do something with the president. At least he said he was, and whether he would have or not, I don't know. But he was arrested. And there are other times when especially in a crowd when you got hundreds and thousands of people and everybody crushing in on you and so forth. You just don't know what happened. I remember a time in Costa Rica when President Kennedy was down there on a visit and giving a talk, and he was leaving by helicopter right after the talk, and the people just swarmed on the thing, and like those presidential helicopters have that thing that flaps down, and you've seen them come down the ramp and go back up the ramp and so forth. And we literally had to shove people off the ramp to be able to close the thing, to be able to take the helicopter off and all that. So it's, there are quite a few crowd times when you just wonder about it, yeah.
Well, when did you first hear about the president planning a trip to Texas?
I got a call on November 4th that I was going to be assigned the advance. And I believe at that time also they said somebody would be joining me. Ordinarily, in those days, 2 people went out and went out at about the same time. But because he had some stops both in Florida and in Maryland a week or so before the Texas stops, and also because he had not only the Dallas stop, but he had Houston, San Antonio, Fort Worth, Dallas, and then he was going on over the LBJ Ranch. The President's Protective Division, the White House detail in those days was pretty much decimated for advance agents for all these places. So they said, you're going to get on a special plane and you're going to go out and do the advance. And we don't have the complete schedule yet, but we'll have more for you probably on the 8th of November. And I did get more information on the 8th and did some things at headquarters and made phone calls to Dallas field office to let them know we were coming, and wrote a memorandum for the record that I had called the Dallas field office that we were coming and so forth. Found out a few more things, and then I think they said earlier here that on a special plane was one of the people dropped off at the various stops here. And then the agent to help me, who by the way actually was my senior, and if it had been any other time, and just like 1 or 2 trips and we had all, he probably would have been the advance agent and I would have been the assistant. But because he was doing an advance in Florida and wasn't able to come here until just a couple of days before the event, I was the advance agent there.
Can you talk about what goes into advance work, especially when there's a planned motorcade and a speech?
Well, there's an awful lot more involved now, and I like to think that, and I think the Warren Commission showed that I did, if not everything that we usually do, probably a little bit more than we usually do. That, or did, I shouldn't say do, because now they got all kinds of things that we didn't have and all kinds of people that we didn't have. But the advance agent has to work with what they call a political advance man or woman that comes from the White House. Sometimes they borrow them from, maybe if there are a lot of things going on and all of their advance people are being used, their advance staff, they know of people in the Interior Department or Agriculture Department or something like that that they've used in the past and throw them in. So you work with the advance people that are representing the White House, whether they're from the White House or not. You work with the local committee. You work with the Air Force that will be bringing the president to the event. You work with either the Marine helicopter people or the Army helicopter people, if there's going to be a helicopter movement involved. You work with the local press and the White House press, and it's quite a coordinating job. You naturally, then you go to the police jurisdictions. Now, that varies. If there's an airport if there's an airport that's outside the city limits, that might be the jurisdiction of maybe a sheriff's department. And perhaps the state patrol or the highway police or whatever that particular state calls their state group, maybe they have jurisdiction of the roads to and from as well as the sheriff's department. And then, of course, if there's a city involved, then you've got the city police. So you have to coordinate all of this with the various police jurisdictions, be it 1, 2, 3, or whatever. And it's quite a coordination job, so forth.
Was the advance work in Dallas typical of any other city you did advance work for?
Yes and no. It was, for example, most field offices, when you would do an advance, whether it was, let's say, Syracuse or let's say someplace else, there's usually a VIP section in the police department that handles VIPs, hence the name, that come to town. And, you know, whether it's a well-known rock group or whether it's somebody that's a government official or whatever. And often that person is a sergeant, a lieutenant, or once in a while a captain. And the chief of police or whatever assigns that person to be your liaison, and you work through that person, so forth. It was the very first time that I ever worked on any advance, before or after that, with the chief of police, the deputy chiefs of police, and the assistant chief of police. That, you know, that was unheard of. Chief Curry, Batchelor, Stevens, I can't remember all the names, but there were 4 or 5 of them that were either deputy chiefs or assistant chiefs or something like that. They were a part of it from the get-go. In the meetings, not just meeting with some sergeant or some lieutenant or something like that. I mean, you met with Chief Curry or the deputy or the assistant chiefs of police. And when you did the route, instead of going with a sergeant or a lieutenant or something like that, you had 1 or 2 of them in the thing. That was amazing. And then on the other side, on the Secret Service side, if you went to Syracuse or to Toledo or Chicago or something like that, yes, the agent in charge would talk to you and find out what was going on each day during the event and so forth. But the person that you worked with, the person that took you around to the host committee or to the hospitals, to the this, to that, whatever it is, part of the advance that you were doing, was usually one of the agents or a couple of the agents in that field office. Forrest Sorrells, the agent in charge of the Dallas field office, spent every waking moment with me for that 10 days that I was here, between the 12th and the 22nd, with me from morning till late at night. Unheard of.
The motorcade route is something that's come under a great deal of controversy in the years since, mainly because there's been a charge that the route was changed at the last minute. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, in a couple of words, that's false. That myth is wrong. That route, at first we didn't know what route it was going to be because we didn't know where the speech/luncheon site was going to be. It was either going to be probably at the Women's Building at the State Fairgrounds, or it was going to be at the Trade Mart. And early on, in the first couple of days of the advance, went to both places. And it was later determined that for one reason or another it would be better to go to the Trade Mart. And so then it was pretty much, if the White House wanted people to see the president, and the president see the people, and going to the Trade Mart, but the most people are going to be downtown, that route almost had to be what it was, except for maybe a couple of places out near the airport. But eventually we had to go down Main Street, and of course it's one way here now, but then we had to come over towards the school book depository and turn left onto Elm here to be able to go onto the Stemmons Freeway, which we needed to do best and most practical way to get to the Trade Mart.
If the motorcade had continued to go straight onto Main and then try to get onto the on-ramp to Stemmons Freeway, there's a concrete divider which separates the road there. The Secret Service would have never authorized a motorcade to go over a concrete divider, would they?
Well, that wouldn't have been too good. I mean, theoretically, you could probably make some kind of a little bridge-like thing to get over it and whatever, but it was decided by the police and by the local by the local field office and by me that knowing what we had to do and where we had to go and the time of day we had to do it, that was the best route. And often, and this is not a tale out of school, but if a president or a vice president or something like that is going to a town, to a city, to be seen and to see them, often it's arranged so that they're going around noontime or they're going around supper time or time that people are getting out to go home. Why is that? Well, why not? Because people are coming out of the office buildings, people are downtown shopping, you know, especially at noon, they're not home cooking supper or whatever. And so you've got a built-in crowd if you take someone down to a downtown area that has a lot of office buildings, a lot of stores and things like that. And so that's one of the reasons that they came downtown.
Were you part of the team that made the decision to use the Trade Mart instead of the Women's Building at Fair Park?
In a way, I had no objection to the Trade Mart. And I had there was some problem with the Women's Building, with the catering and as I recall and think now, we're talking almost 40 years, but a lot of which I was trying to forget things rather than trying to remember things. And as I recall, I think there were columns and things like that in the Women's Building where the luncheon was going to be, and some other problems. And it was pretty quick shot to just, since we had to come downtown anyway for the staff, and he wanted to be seen and have a motorcade through downtown, and then onto the Stemmons Freeway and right off to the Trade Mart, which would be pretty good then to go back to the airport.
We've done interviews in the past with some of the local civic leaders that arranged the luncheon at the Trade Mart, and a couple of them have noted that the Trade Mart has the different tiers with the tables.
Yes, it sure does.
There. And
that was a new one for me, as a matter of fact.
They tell the story that they were trying to open up that area because the demand for seats was so great, and they talk about having trouble having confrontations with the Secret Service trying to open up that area to get seating up there. Do you recall that?
No, I don't, but you couldn't really have, there were, as I recall, there were various of these walkways from one side to the other and up like one level and another level and another level. I can't really remember, but there were probably 2 or 3 levels at least of these walkways across and all that. And you wouldn't want anybody over him, and so another thing that has to be considered is that you only have so many people to put on posts or to be part of a security thing. The police department, the sheriff's department, the highway patrol, what do they call? I can't remember now. What's it called here in Texas?
The Rangers?
No, there's the ones that give the, if you're speeding and you're out on a regular
The state troopers?
Yeah, the state troopers. Mm-hmm. All right. Every one of them did a wonderful job, and let me remind me where we are in this thing.
Okay.
But let me say right now that there is no way, possible, shape, or manner that the Secret Service would be able to come close to doing what they do without the local authorities, be it the city police, the sheriff's department, the state patrol, highway troopers, whatever. There's absolutely no way that, because especially back in those days when there were very few people. Now there are quite a number more of Secret Service agents than we had, plus some other technical things and all that we do. But we had very, very, very few people, and especially when we were making all these stops, so that it took away from our groups of people because they were out doing advances and so forth. And we depended greatly on the city police, the highway patrol, and the sheriff's department. And as I recall, they big-browed and stole all kinds of people. You know, if I remember right, there were probably 50 or 60 police for the Trade Mart itself. And, you know, police along the route, and police here, and police there, and so forth. And there are many things you could do if you had thousands of people to do it, but they bent over backwards and gave us very, very good cooperation. Now, like I said before, where were we?
We were talking about the Trade Mart.
Yeah, okay. Well, you see, if we'd have had oodles of law enforcement people to be able to put on all of those things, you know, yeah, we probably could have accommodated them, but it wasn't possible.
In your advance work, did you ever visit Parkland Hospital?
Oh yes, went there before the event.
That was standard to always visit the local hospital and arrange?
Well, it's not just the local hospital, it'd be the hospital where it would be closest to whatever place you're going to be. You know, if your stop envisions an overnight at a hotel and a ball game and a civic reception or this or that, it's not uncommon to have 7 or 8 different, especially if it's an overnight, events going on, afternoon, evening, the next morning or whatever. So you pick out what is the best hospital in the area that you might be in at a given time. If it's a matter of not too much of a difference in time, let's say there's a very small hospital near a hotel that you're going to be staying overnight, but maybe within 3 or 4 minutes there's a much better hospital with better emergency facilities and all that, you'd probably go to that one. But you pick out, depending on where your protectee will be at the time, the best hospital to go to. Then again, depending on the event, sometimes you have pre-posted ambulances. Like if it's many times at a hotel for an overnight, a city will, if it's a city ambulance, sometimes they're private ambulances. You know, again, it depends on the city that you're going to, but you'll able to have pre-posted ambulances, something or other, and then you depend on the doctors and the medical people to take you where they think is best. A heart attack is better to go to this hospital. A gunshot wound is better to go to that hospital.
Dallas during this period of time had some political problems. It was a hotbed of extremist activity, and Adlai Stevenson had an incident here in October.
President Johnson had an incident.
Exactly, in 1960. Obviously, you were aware of this. Was there any extra precautions taken, or was there a heightened sense of awareness, I should say, because of this?
I think there was with the police, and that's my personal opinion, is why Chief Curry and the assistant chief and some deputy chiefs and so forth were part of this whole thing all the time, and maybe even Forrest Sorrells. That may be why, for the first time ever, instead of being assigned a lieutenant or a sergeant or something like that, to be the liaison, that these high-ranking officers were part of this advance. Now that's hindsight. I didn't know that at the time, but I mean, certainly that it makes sense to me that that's what was going on.
Well, let's get to the morning of the 22nd, if that's all right. Unless there's anything important that I've left out along the
I'll
way.
probably think of 15 things after I leave.
Okay, well, if you come up with anything, let me know. But the morning of the 22nd, you had been here in Dallas the entire time.
Since the 12th.
Okay, so go ahead and let's talk about Love Field that morning when you met the party, and pick up the story there.
I think I had a few things to do and went over to, before Love Field, went over to the Trade Mart and left Agent Grant off, who had joined me a couple of days before that and who was going to be the site agent at the Trade Mart. And naturally there were many questions to be answered by people coming up to you, and like there are in every advance. What do we do here? How about this problem? How about that problem? So,
was the bubble top planned to be used in Dallas?
the bubble top, of course, was not an armored car. You know, the doors and the chassis and so forth of that car, that Lincoln, was not an armored car, nor was it bulletproof on the bubble top, which was plastic. I think most people that even knew there was such a thing figured that it probably was. And looking back at it, you'd wonder sometimes how many people might have tried something in parade situations, but thought, you know, what good will it do us? He's going to be in this car that you know, you'd have to hit with a rocket, or you'd have to hit with a hand grenade or something like that. But it was raining, and the telephone call to Fort Worth, to and from Fort Worth, said, if it is raining, leave the bubble top off. If it stops raining, if it's raining, leave the bubble top on. If it stops raining, take off the bubble top. It stopped raining. Now you would wonder something that I've thought about an awful lot. If that bubble top had been on, would Oswald have tried the shot at all? Because he might have thought, oops, you know, this isn't going to work because you know, it's bulletproof. Or the next thing is, if he had tried, that thing has a curvature to it, would it maybe have hit and glanced off? The next thing, that thing was put together in sections, and it had these strips about this wide, metal strips, and that thing was configured so you could have the bubble top on the front, you could have it on just on the back, you could have it all off, you could have it all on, and a couple other configurations that you could have. If Oswald had said, well, okay, I'm going to try it anyway, and shot, maybe it would have hit one of those metal pieces to help keep the thing on. So you just never know. That's something to think about.
If you would just start with the presidential party arriving at Love Field and take me through the motorcade.
Okay. To jump back a couple of minutes, the vice president's plane was in, and so that's the small staff of his, plus his agents and the vice president and so forth. They greeted the local host committee and some other people, and then went over to be in the area where we were going to spot the president's plane. The press plane had come in prior to that, because the press plane, at least in those days, and I would imagine still, the press plane tries to leave after the president leaves someplace, so that they're able to see. It's like a death watch, frankly. They're waiting to see if something happens getting on the plane, or before he gets on the plane, if the plane crashes or whatever. So then the president's plane takes off, the press plane gets up in the air, and if it's a far enough trip, then they somehow try to get ahead of the president, and then they land first so that they're in their press pen and so forth and doing their thing when the president arrives. Again, like the death watch or something, see whatever might happen. So you've got the press, and you got the local host committee, and you got the vice president's group visiting the president. And the president comes, and Mrs. Kennedy and some staff and agents and whatever come down, and goes over to the chain link fence that was there. I have pictures of it, that there are all kinds of people on the other side of the fence, and there are all kinds of people on the airplane side of the fence. You can't even see the fence. There are almost as many people on the airplane side of the fence because of the hangers on and the staff and the press and the this and that, you know. So, and President Kennedy and Ms. Kennedy go along the fence greeting people and being seen and seeing people, and for a few minutes, and then they go over and get in their car, and the motorcade takes off. A special cut was made in the fence to allow the motorcade to go out to a certain place, to start the motorcade and all that. And the pilot car is now gone ahead, and the lead car that I was in was just ahead of the president's vehicle, follow-up car behind him, and then some other vehicles, and the vice president and the staff, and it was quite a motorcade. Buses and staff cars and VIP cars and things of that type.
Who was in the lead car with you?
The lead car was driven by Chief Curry in either his or another unmarked Dallas police car, driving, so he was in the left front seat. I was in the right front seat. Sheriff Decker was in the rear seat, and SAIC Sorrells, the agent in charge, Sorrells from the Dallas field office, was in the back seat. Unprecedented.
About how far ahead of the limousine did the lead car stay throughout most of the motorcade?
You usually try to be pretty darn close, so that they can see where you're going and all that, because if you have to go to a hospital or you got to do this or that or whatever, in those days, especially when the driver didn't come, now probably one of the drivers would have been part of the advance team. I think I said before that you'd have site agents, depending on how many sites. You'd have a motorcade agent, you'd have the technical people, the intelligence people, an airport agent, the site at the Trade Mart agent, and so forth. But the lead car, the presidential car, follows that lead car, and he stays up pretty darn close to the lead car to keep anybody from coming in between the two cars, just like the follow-up car is almost on their bumper, to prevent people, things, cars, etc., from coming out of a side street and being able to get in between. As a matter of fact, that's the only reason why Clint Hill was able to get on that car, was because it was so close to the president's car and all that.
In some of the films that we have here at the museum that show the motorcade going along, you see the buildings downtown, and there's open windows and people looking out of the windows. Yeah. Was that something that concerned you as you were going along? It concerned
you, but in those days there was nothing you could do about it. Mm-hmm. If there's a parade situation today, each field office has already made a survey of known motorcade routes, whether it's in Dallas or New York or wherever, to probably the areas that people would be going to in a motorcade type situation. Agents have inspected the building with the maintenance people, the building manager, owner, whatever. And today's modern buildings, most of them, you can't open up a window. These new high-rise office buildings and all that, the windows don't open. You can't even throw a chair through one if you wanted to. There are some of the older buildings and so forth that you still can open windows. But what they do, they put out a notice. I mean, this is not a country where by fiat you can just say you can't open your windows. I mean, it's not a totalitarian country, but you can request people not to open their windows. You can request people not to bring all their friends down and be in your window, because boy, this would be a great vantage point to see this motorcade. Please don't do that. If you want to see, go on down and whatever. Or if you are in your windows, they got to be closed or whatever. And they have enough people now stationed along with radios and counter sniper teams on certain buildings that look down on other buildings and all that belong to the Secret Service counter sniper teams. And if they see an open window, or if they see something that looks suspicious, and also it's requested that people not be on rooftops and all that. And there are certain things that they do so that you'd know if there's someone on that rooftop, that's a security person or whatever, you know. So if they see anything that type, immediately it's broadcast, such and such a building, the 6th floor, right-hand side, there's an open window. That gets broadcast to those agents or the police in that area so that they can immediately check it out or at least keep it under surveillance if they can't get there in time. And at the same time, it goes to the motorcade.
We have a home movie that shows the motorcade making a turn. I believe it's from Lemon Avenue onto Main Street, and an agent or two agents from the follow-up car come and ride on the side of the presidential limousine. Why would they do that when making a turn?
They may have seen something in the crowd, or maybe people started out, you know, it's not uncommon. As a matter of fact, it's common for people to try to get out, touch the car, touch the president or whatever, and that's why that's a bone of contention sometimes between the president and the staff and the Secret Service. We'd love to have motorcycles completely surrounding his car, but noise, lack of sight back and forth, etc. They just don't want it. We'd like to have them in a bubble all the time if we could, and not just a plastic one, but another one. But you have to give and take in these type of things. And I would imagine something happened on that route where either people were coming out or something else caused them to jump off and run up. Often, I mean, that's just done all the time.
At one point during the Dallas motorcade, there was a group of people, and they had a sign that said, you know, please stop and shake our hands. And I believe the motorcade did slow long enough for some folks to shake the president's hand. Do you recall that?
I don't, but that happens a lot. You can plan, depending on the president that it is, the type of things that you know he likes or doesn't like, or she. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not a chauvinist, but so far we haven't had a lady president, so I'll probably keep saying she and all that. But rather than probably keep saying he. But President Kennedy, you could almost always figure that he went by a Catholic church or Catholic school and there were some nuns and some kids out there. He's going to stop. I don't know how many times. You just would know that. And if that was on your particular route, you'd try to put some police there ahead of time and all that, you know. And if, like the sign you said, sometimes there's some signs that you know what they're going to be. But as you're going along and all of a sudden you see this sign, you say, oh, that's a catchy sign, or that's something that I'll bet you that those people about 10 yards behind us or less are probably going to stop. And it happens a lot. Frankly, I'd rather see the president go along and going along, all of a sudden the president would see something, be interesting, stop the car, I want to go over here, because that's an unplanned thing. Now, where it's dangerous is that if somebody has a catchy thing or some reason, somehow it's going to tickle their fancy, and then plan it so that he's probably going to stop here, so I'm going to be the assassin here and so forth. But it's the true unplanned things. You don't have to worry as much on those unplanned things. Sometimes people, didn't that drive you nuts when he stopped at such a place? No, frankly, I'd rather have him stop there when no one knew that he was going to do it than someplace that you would know about.
There had been some anti-Kennedy literature in Dallas, the wanted for treason poster and the black bordered ad in the Dallas Morning News. You saw this prior to the motorcade?
I did.
What did you think about it?
Well, it's a free country. They can say what they want. You'd be concerned about it, but you've made your plans and you've done the best thing you can and just hope that everything will work.
Did you report it to anybody, or was that not?
Well, the police brought it. I can't remember now. Someone brought to my attention Mr. Sorrells had already seen the flyer, for example. The police brought it to my attention. They knew it before I did.
Do you have any idea whether President Kennedy saw any of that literature?
I do not know.
During the motorcade, were you focused on the car, or were you looking at the crowds?
I probably should have had a head on a swivel because I would be looking forward. For example, I remember looking forward here, at the overpass, and seeing people up there who had been arrangement that there'd be a policeman, at least up there, and if anybody, they couldn't be directly over us and so forth. Well, there were some people standing on that, and I was trying to kind of making a motion like this, to the policeman, get these people away from us and so forth. I also would keep looking behind to make sure that, to tell Chief Curry to speed up, to slow up, to whatever, depending on the situation. I'd be looking at the crowds also, just in case I could see something and broadcast to the follow-up car, or particularly the president's car, saying, watch out for such and such on the right or left. So my head would have been on a swivel the whole time, looking ahead, looking forward, looking sideways, looking backward.
As you entered Dealey Plaza, did you make any comments to Chief Curry?
I don't remember that I did.
I seem to remember reading in your testimony that you made the comment that you were only about 5 minutes away.
Oh, yes. I think I probably asked him, aren't we about 4 or 5 minutes from the Trade Center? And I think he said yes. And I said, okay, so I can't remember now whether I broadcast to the people out at the Trade Mart. I think he did to his the various officers that were on duty out at the Trade Mart.
Well, if you can, tell me in as much detail as you remember about the assassination itself.
I believe I was just about to go under the pretty close anyway to the underpass to go on the Stemmons Freeway sometime a little bit later, and I heard a shot like that, and then I heard another one, and then that third one was a little closer to the second one than the second one was to the first one. And I didn't think firecrackers, I didn't think pop balloons, I thought shots. And I thought immediately that it, because I was facing that way, I thought immediately that it had come from over my right-hand shoulder, which in fact it had. And it was so quick and all that, and I think almost immediately we heard from the president's car, the assistant agent in charge, Kellerman, said something about floor it or hurry or the president might be hit. Around that same time, a motorcyclist pulled up alongside of us, I believe, and said to Chief Curry that the president had been hit. And both of us said to one another, we got to get to Parkland Hospital, and he started broadcasting whatever he had to do, and I started calling on my radio to people and so forth, and he floored it, and we went out Stemmons Freeway going like heck, and as a matter of fact, lost most of the motorcade, that wasn't part of the security bubble. And as a matter of fact, they, not even knowing what had happened, or maybe wondering what had happened, part of the motorcade pulled into the Trade Mart, not knowing that we'd gone right on by the Trade Mart and gone to Parkland Hospital. But we went about as fast as you can go out through there, and I don't know how Clint Hill ever stayed on that car.
During the assassination itself, did you see the president or Mrs. Kennedy?
No, you mean back?
Behind you?
No.
You didn't see anything? So you weren't actually aware who was hit or if anyone was hit?
No, I just heard the shots and then was told that the president had been hit and so forth. Yeah.
And you think the shots came from?
I know they came from my back right.
Back right.
I'd fired enough before and I'd fired enough since, and on firing ranges and all that. I knew rifle fire, and I knew where the shots came from.
Well, as you got to Parkland Hospital, why don't you pick up the story there and tell me what happened?
Chief Curry had already had someone notify the hospital that we were on our way. And when we arrived, I ran in the emergency area and met someone coming with a couple of gurneys and all that, and turned around and helped them get back out, these gurneys out to the car. Of course, Governor Conley and his wife had been in the jump seats, which are fold up seats, and they were in front of the President and Mrs. Kennedy. And Governor Conley had to be moved before the President could be moved. And then I helped put President Kennedy and with other agents and people and all that on one of the gurneys and go into the emergency room area and to the trauma place there where we were guided to. And originally went on in with the President and the doctor and the people pushing the gurney and all that. And then not too much later, I don't even know how much longer, but I went back outside to make sure that, because my advance wasn't done, make sure that we had people from the hospital, just letting the proper people in the area, that there were agents in the area. I soon found out that they were already taking care of President Johnson in another area close by. The agents had him and so forth. And then went to one of the offices nearby where there's a telephone and called Washington and kept the line open with Washington with our Secret Service headquarters all the time we were there.
Did you get a good look at the President's wounds when you approached the motorcade?
No, I don't know if Clint Hill had already put his coat over his head at that time or not. I don't recall whether, but I know that when we were in the trauma room and when they were starting to take care of him before I left the room, that he was not moving. He was extremely gray. I mean, I can't describe the color that he was.
Did you feel at that time that it was a fatal wound?
I think I did in my mind.
The back of the limousine, it was pretty bloody. Did you notice that when you went up to it?
No.
You didn't? Did you encounter Mrs. Kennedy or have any communication with her during this?
I didn't have any communication with her, but she went on in, with us to the trauma room. And she was in there for a while, and then I think her staff took her out and so forth.
What were you feeling at this moment?
Shock. You wonder, everything is going through your mind, what could I have done that I didn't do? How did I mess up, and if so, how? I was the first agent to lose a president, and to this day, I'm still the first agent to lose a president. I can't say that I couldn't believe it because that it can happen all the time, but I was in shock that it did happen. I don't mean in shock like people with a wound or something that go into shock, but I was just my gosh, it did happen type of thing.
There have been stories that in the immediate aftermath there in Parkland there was some confrontations, an actual physical struggle between some FBI agents and some Secret Service agents. Do you recall that?
No, I don't. No, see, I wouldn't have been. Right off the bat, I was inside, and I was in the trauma room, and then from there to the office and I stayed there at that telephone and all that, and I didn't leave until we took the body out to put it in the the Undertaker's hearse or whatever it was. I think it was a hearse, and then riding on out to the airport to help put the body on the airplane. Some of the agents had already left by that time because they'd taken then Vice President Humphrey. Listen to me, Vice President Johnson. I'm sorry. I was with Vice President Humphrey, so once in a while I'll get them mixed up. But some of the agents had already gone out with Vice President Johnson, and then, of course, he was not sworn in because he waited for Mrs. Kennedy to get out there before he was sworn in, and that was after we got out of the place.
A point of controversy that has come up over the years is the fact that while the motorcade was there in the Parkland Bay there, some Secret Service agents got some buckets and sponges and started wiping out the back of the limousine. I know you weren't part of the group that did that, but do you have any idea why they would have done that immediately at that point?
No, I don't.
Okay. It's just something I wanted to ask because it's stuff that comes up.
Yeah, right.
Okay, and one other thing I wanted to ask you about the motorcade. Another myth is that the lead car actually stopped after you emerged from the triple underpass. The lead car
never stopped.
Never stopped. Okay. Okay. Well, once you got back out to Love Field with the casket, why don't you go ahead and pick up the story there, if you would?
Well, waited outside the airplane. Chief Curry, had gone out with Vice President Johnson. So Chief Curry was inside, and he was in there when the federal judge came and swore in Vice President Johnson to become president. And then pretty soon the plane started to taxi and left. And I rode with Chief Curry in his car down to police headquarters. And agent in charge Sorrells was I don't know if he was at his office, but eventually he came over to police headquarters also, and I was there in police headquarters for a number of hours, and I saw the complete chaos, that was there. You wouldn't believe how many people were in there. People in off the street, the police themselves, the news people. You could hardly walk up and down the corridors for the amount of people that were in there. At one point, I looked in on, his name was Fritz. I can't remember if he was the captain or what, but he was head
Captain Will Fritz.
He was homicide. I think he was chief of homicide detectives, and listened in on some of his and Mr. Sorrells, with them questioning Oswald, and back around. Then sometime later, I went over to FBI office, and then eventually was taken to one of the Air Force bases near here, and rode back to Washington, D.C. to Andrews Air Force Base with some of the evidence that they had collected, and a couple of the FBI agents that were on the plane. And we landed back there about 6 in the morning, 6 or 6:30 in the morning at Andrews Air Force Base Eastern time.
While you were at the police station, did you ever see Lee Harvey Oswald?
Yeah.
Did you sit in on some of the questioning or anything like that?
No, I didn't sit in on any. I watched some of it, and I saw a couple of times when I think they moved him from one place to another place, but never talked to him, never.
Considering your position, did you have any personal feelings when you saw this man?
I suppose. Yeah, I really can't even think right now about it because I still. No, I can't recall any particular feelings that I had about him.
Is there anything else relating to the FBI that occurred here in Dallas that's worth putting on the record?
Not that I had anything to do with.
Do you recall what the initial thought was? I mean, there's been talk that originally they might have thought it was some sort of conspiracy, that it was a Russian plot or something like that. Were you privy to any of those discussions by the FBI?
No.
Okay.
No. I just know that they wondered if it was part of a plot to get the president and the vice president. That's why they wanted him out and back in Washington as soon as possible. And I wasn't a part of any discussion really about that.
Okay. Well, once you got back in Washington, what part did you play in the funeral, and what other duties did you have?
I gave a written statement on the 23rd to my knowledge of everything that I knew that I had done and people had done on the 22nd. And then on the 1st of December, I wrote 2 memoranda. One, everything that I could remember about the advance from the first hearing about it on the 4th of November through the 21st of November, and then a separate one, which was more detailed than the one that I'd done on the 23rd, for events that I could recall on the 22nd. And, but that wasn't until December 1st, but you asked me about the funeral. So I was on duty at the funeral. I was on duty at the grave site. And that was really something, the funeral and being a part of it, and the music and everything that was going on. I remember just being extremely sad, being extremely sorry. And the Secret Service kept me pretty busy. Like I said, the day after it, I was in, and I went to work each day. Primarily the first few days, it was all talking to people about the advance and this and that, and writing things for the record and all that. Eventually, I gave testimony to the Warren Report, and then later, what was it, 78 or whenever it was, that the House committee, special committee, I testified at that also. But I stayed on. I don't know that there was any formal request, but I think I may have indicated in some way that I wanted to stay on protection for a while. Ordinarily, I probably would have been transferred. As I said, I came from Syracuse to in those days, the White House Detail, which is now Presidential Protective Division. I got there in '61, spring of '61. This was fall of '63. I probably, without anything happening in Dallas, I probably would have been there another year, maybe a year and a half, and then transferred to some field office, then back maybe to Washington in some capacity, and then back to another field office, because it's not uncommon for agents to be transferred 6, 7, or 8 times in their career. In my mind, I felt that I owed it to protection, to stay in protection for a while if they would let me. And the Secret Service didn't fire me. I don't think there was a reason to, but I mean, they could have found reasons to. They didn't fire me. They didn't transfer me to one of the places that people hear about, if there's an agent that they want to discipline or something, whether it's the FBI, the Secret Service, or Internal Revenue. There are always 1 or 2 offices where they're going to ship Joe Blow off to one of the offices, kind of for penance or whatever it is. They never sent me to someplace in Montana to an office or something like that.
What did you talk about with the other agents? some of the other agents that were involved on the Dallas detail. What did you talk about in the aftermath?
In a way, a lot of the agents didn't talk to me about it, except in one regard. And to my dying day, I will be very grateful for this. They would come up to me and say, if it had to happen to any agent win, we're glad it was you. And I mean, you know, originally, but what they meant that in a good way. I took pride in the fact that they knew that I had always done a good advance, that I had done at least as much and probably in certain phases of this Dallas advance more than most people had done. They knew I didn't drink, and there was always that, you know, there was that problem that had come up. They knew I didn't fool around, and so I took that as a compliment, and they meant it as a compliment. We didn't talk very much other than, we didn't talk too much about the advance or what had happened. I think part of it was they didn't want to bring up certain things, but really about the most, and to this day I still get some of that if it had to happen, we're glad it was you. One thing though, here's an anecdote for you. After I was at headquarters, I would, you know, get to work about 7:38 in the morning, and I'd go back. I'd leave home about 6:30, both because there was so much going on or something to do, and because you couldn't get out of D.C. at 5 or 5:30 and go south on Shirley Highway or the Interstate 95 because you're bumper to bumper, and it'd take you, you know, if you waited at the office an extra hour, you'd probably only be 10 minutes longer getting home if you just started. So often, and especially in the fall and the winter and the early spring, I went over what's called the Memorial Bridge. And if you've been in Washington, Memorial Bridge, as you're going into Virginia, you look up at Arlington Cemetery. And at night, you see a little flickering light. And that's President Kennedy's grave. And that was my way home. And so for a number of years, every time I went home, I'd cross Virginia, over into Virginia Memorial Bridge, and I'd see that little flickering light. And that was quite a reminder.
We'll wrap up American Perspectives tonight with Robert Strauss. The longtime Democratic Party chairman was in Dallas the day President Kennedy was shot. He shared his memories for an oral history project conducted by the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza.
Bob, coming to 1963, there was a particular political situation going on in Texas at the time. And now, especially in light of what you just told us, that politics doesn't mean that much, there was quite a political furor going on.
Well, I didn't say politics doesn't mean that much. I said, you misread it. What I said was, politics doesn't have to keep people affect their interpersonal relationships. That's a big difference between that. I'm a Democrat.
Wasn't that happening in Texas when Kennedy came to Dallas?
When Kennedy came to Dallas, the political fight wasn't between Republicans and Democrats as much as it was within the Democratic Party, within the administration. It was between the Yarborough wing of the Democratic Party and the Johnson wing of the Democratic Party. They were at each other's throats. Well, they just because Lyndon Johnson represented a different constituency than did Ralph Yarborough. Not because one of them was necessarily right or one of them wrong, they were different. Ralph Yarborough represented the left, Lyndon Johnson left, and Lyndon Johnson represented the moderate to conservative Democrats. Their interpersonal relationship was very bum. John Connally, being Lyndon Johnson's closest friend and man, had a terrible relationship with Ralph Yarborough. That being true, people like me who were close to Johnson and Connally were on the opposite sides of the political fence from Ralph Yarborough. We didn't necessarily, well, we thought about Republicans, but you know, a fight in the family is a hell of a lot worse than a fight with strangers.
Well, now, the Kennedy visit was patterned largely to try to solve that problem, was it not?
It was not.
It was not? Why?
No.
What was the purpose?
People have said that, but it had, if you were going to solve a problem between Yarborough and Johnson, the place to solve it was where they were, which is Washington. Not where they weren't, which was Texas. But it makes good lore, and people like to say that, and more people have said it and written it than one can imagine. The primary purpose of Jack Kennedy coming to Texas was to end his political fences generally, and also raise money. And that's kind of lost in this whole story. But if you go back and look at it properly, you'll find that was really why he came. People who knew. I knew Connally and I were by then, and this was in '63. We were very close politically and personally. A friendship that I treasured and still have with his widow and talk to regularly, and with his children. But Connally, the governor, had talked about the fact, he and I just talking on the phone one day, me in Dallas, he and Austin, that he was going up there, that the president wanted to come up. And while he was in Washington on that trip, he called. Helen and I were talking about it just last night. I was telling her I was going to do this interview and trying to think through and being sure my recollection was right. And I said, do you remember, she remembered these events. And Connally called from up there and said to me, "Damn, Strauss, I've had a miserable day." And I said, "What's wrong?" Well, he said, Johnson's in a bad humor because Kennedy called me up to talk to me about a trip to Texas. And I don't think he spent any time with Johnson talking about it. He had me up. And I couldn't talk him out of it. All he's coming down there for is to raise a lot of money. And we need that money in Texas ourselves. And they'll take much as I'd like to have in the state. We don't need him in here right now, and we have our own fundraising to do, and it'd be nothing but trouble. And Yarborough, bad humor. Johnson will be in bad humor. We'll be in bad humor, and we just had the Adlai-Stevenson trip shortly before then, when Adlai-Stevenson was spit at by some kind of right-wingers who took a dim view of him. It was embarrassing, and the climate wasn't right for him to come here. But the president urged, and John Connally, of course, was pleased to accept. John Connally and President Kennedy got along very well. Remember that John Connally had been his Secretary of Navy and left that job after 1 year to come home and run for governor of Texas. So Connally said, "I'll be back tomorrow and we'll talk." And that's when we first started talking about how to do the Texas trip. And he asked, my recollection is, he asked John Singleton and Jack Valenti in Houston to kind of be responsible for Houston, for him, he the governor. And he asked me to kind of be responsible for the Dallas portion of that trip. And I forget who it was in Fort Worth, but anyway, we divided up the responsibilities. Now, the business establishment in Dallas, who we needed, kind of took a dim view of me. You'll remember better than most people, there was a Citizens Council and there was a Citizens Establishment that, my recollection is, you never did particularly well with, and my recollection is very clear that they never cared much for me. I was independent, and highly independent, and so were you. So nice people like Eric Johnson and Bob Cullum and Stemmons and others took a dim view of my having the voice of the governor in Dallas for that event. It later turned out to be a lunch plan for a luncheon. So it was a murky situation around here, not totally pleasant.
Did you specifically try to discourage President Kennedy or his people from coming here because of the Adlai-Stevenson attack and also the LBJ incident in the office?
Well, when you say me, I want to make it clear, I don't want to travel under false colors. I didn't know President Kennedy that well. I was not that far up. I had, keep in mind, so you'll clearly understand, people always assume that I was terribly close to Lyndon Johnson. Well, I liked Lyndon Johnson, and I respected him, and I admired him, and I liked what he did prior to the time he was in the White House, and I liked his Great Society, a great deal of it. I probably liked it better than I should have. History has shown it wasn't all perfect. But my relationship with Johnson really came through John Connally. I was John Connally's close friend, and so I would be traveling under false colors if I were to lead people to believe that now that they're both gone, that I was an intimate of Johnson's. I wasn't. But I mean, Kennedy's, I wasn't. I was close to Johnson. But Lyndon Johnson, if he had a meeting of 10 or 12 people closest to him in Texas, I would not have been in that meeting. If he had had a meeting of 20 or 25 people in Texas, I would have made that meeting. You understand what I'm talking about. Now, if John Connally had had a meeting of 2 people by 1963, I would have been one of the 2. Probably been Frank Irwin, now deceased, and me. So that's how these political relationships develop.
Now, you had some role in the preparations for President Kennedy's visit and the luncheon at the Trade Mart.
Yes.
Explain that, what your role was.
Well, John Connally, then governor, I said earlier, asked different people in the different cities to kind of be his representative. And Kenny O'Donnell had a very nice woman whose name was Betty Forsling. Later became Betty Forsling Harris. She married one of the members of the Harris family of A. Harrison Company while she was down here. And she was down here, and she was close to the Kennedy White House. And they named her to take care of the president's business in Dallas. And Connally had me taking care of the governor's business in Dallas. And the same thing took place in other states. That's just the way things work, because there are always arguments over who's going to do what, and how they're going to sit, and who's going to ride where. And so in that role, I then worked with the members of the Dallas business community that I described to you earlier, and said that they weren't elated about having me because I really was not one of theirs. I guess I wanted to be. I wasn't on the outside of the people who ran Dallas because I wanted to be. I was on the outside because they didn't want me on the inside. Frankly, I was a younger lawyer, not young, but trying to be successful in town. And I would have liked to have run for, about the height of my ambition, I think, was to run for city council, which is a pretty lousy ambition to have from what I've seen over the years, but that was about the height of mine, and I didn't have no sense to know it then. But they wouldn't have had any part of me, and you of all people, Wes, ought to understand very well.
Well, but they embraced you for that particular occasion, did they not?
Well, I think embrace would be a rather large statement to make, although we certainly got along. Bob Cullum was kind of doing it, and Cullum and I had a very cordial relationship, and we didn't have any difficulty. As a matter of fact, I can remember he and I meeting with the Secret Service when we were planning various possible locations for that luncheon to take place. And they were discussing whether the president should be below the crowd or above the crowd, and what was better. And I remember them saying to me, or to, I don't know which one of us, it could have been Cullum or me, sort of, to both of us, which of these would you fellows think would be best? And I remember one of us or both of us kind of saying, you know, we think we know Dallas, but we don't know anything about presidential security. He just as clearly said that, and the guy smiled. And I've thought about that statement, and my saying it, and his saying it, 1,000 times since Kennedy's assassination, and I've always been glad that I said, presidential security is something I don't know anything about. I remember I was arguing there'd be no parade. And I was arguing that was for the governor. John didn't want a parade here.
John Connally did not
want a parade.
Because of the security? Or?
He thought that he was worried about an incident. Not a tragic incident, but an incident, an unpleasant incident. You forget, or you maybe remember, Dallas we had a sort of a right-wing group here. We had trouble with the what was his name? Bruce Alger congressional group. They were real hardliners, and John was worried about them and worried about others, and Lyndon Johnson had trouble, or Adlai Stevenson had. Later, President Mrs. Johnson did with that crowd during that campaign, I would remind you. And I've always thought that when they roughed up Mrs. Johnson a little bit, and the crowd shoved her around, some of them did, and they had all those hate placards up, and her hat was knocked off, I still remember. And Johnson capitalized on that. He knew immediately that this would offend the people of Texas, so he blew it up into something bigger than it probably was. And I think that that kind of climate was around here.
Were you with them on that occasion, the Adolphus Hotel incident? Were you with the Johnsons?
Yes, I was in that whole group, yes, but I wasn't right with the vice president, as I recall, Lyndon Johnson.
Was this a surly crowd, or was it a loud crowd?
It was a surly, unpleasant, frightening crowd. I think we were somewhere else then getting ready for the next event or something, but I know I wasn't in front of I don't recall being in front of the Adolphus Hotel. I might have been. They were just crossing from the Baker to the Adolphus. It was a surly, unpleasant, angry crowd with mean signs and.
Did you characterize them as any other way? Were they well dressed? Were they scruffies? Were they?
No, they were well dressed people. They.
Some of the people we talked about that element. There's a certain kind of almost a social cachet of being part.
Well, I want to say yes. These were not. We're not talking about riffraff. We're talking about the well-groomed people who attended well-groomed social events in town, and they were highly motivated, very emotional, and lost their sense of balance. And that's where Dallas got this nasty blot it took us so long to overcome.
Well, there was the John Birch Society.
Oh, yes.
And General Walker was here and so forth. Now,
this was the center of all that kind of activity, you have to remember.
Now, the Dallas City Fathers, and as you have called them, the establishment, have often been criticized in retrospect for not having, quote unquote, done something about that. Could they have done anything? What could you do as either a city official or as a city leader?
I think that it's easy to look back. At the time, they probably thought this too will pass. But the truth of the matter is, I don't think this would have affected whether President Kennedy would have been shot or not shot. It has nothing to do with that. I'm just talking about the general political climate in Dallas at that time. If you had important civic leaders, I was not an important civic leader. I was an unimportant, struggling lawyer. If you had important civic leaders standing up and saying, this is wrong and we're not going to have this, and sponsoring events of having people in this town who could address that sort of conduct and what it meant to a community, and we didn't have that at that time.
Should Mayor Cabell have done that?
Well, yes, he certainly would have. He had the right instincts to do it, but it just wasn't done. I don't know. I was a member of the salesmanship club. I guess we could have done it. I didn't speak up there. Nobody spoke up. And if you don't speak up, then pretty soon there's nothing to speak up for. And so I don't blame anyone any more than I blame myself. We were a community that tolerated that kind of atmosphere.
But if it happened again today, Mr. Ambassador, and people would say the freedom of the First Amendment rights allow you this freedom of speech.
Well, I think it allows. I think freedom of speech certainly has to be permitted, but I don't intolerate, not more than tolerated. I mean, say permitted. But you know the old saying that freedom of speech does not entitle you to yell fire in the middle of a crowded theater. and cause a stampede, and so it gets carried too far sometimes.
Where were you in the Trade Mart when you first?
I was waiting for the arrival of the party, of the presidential party. Now, interestingly, although I represented John Connally and I had a prominent, nice seat, but I don't remember there was a head table. If there was, I wasn't at the head table, and I was not on the program that day. And I was sitting there in a sort of a special seat, and with my wife and with Cliff Cassidy, a fellow named Cliff Cassidy and his wife and others, as I recall, and the highway patrol came in.
In uniform?
As I recall, yes, and leaned over and whispered to Cassidy and me. They knew we were both involved in this. There's been an incident. There's been a shooting, and the president or the governor may have been injured. Come on, and they took us. I think it was Cassidy, both of us. It may have just been me. I think it was both of us. Took us to the Trade Mart, rushed us there with the sirens blaring, and I didn't expect to find anything too serious when I got there.
From the Trade Mart to Parkland?
From a Trade Mart to Parkland, yeah.
Hospital.
We got to Parkland Hospital, and I remember as I went in the door, one of the first people I saw was a fellow named Cliff Carter, who was Johnson's administrative assistant. And he said to me, "Bob, the press is dead, the press is dead, the press is dead." He preached about 5 or 6 times. He was in shock. And I said, "Where's Nellie?" He said, "Connie's they just took Connie into surgery." And I said, "Where is she?" And he told me, and I rushed there, and Nellie Conley was leaning up against a wall. I'll never forget it. She was by herself, and she was crying. And I went over to her, and strange, she and I have never discussed this. I just realized at this minute, I don't think I've ever talked to her about this. But she was kind of sobbing, little soft sobs, and I went over and I said, "Nellie, tell me what's going on." And about that time, Conley had an aide who came out of the operating room. He'd stayed in there doing there. I don't know whether he should have been there or not. It's another question. But he inserted himself into that situation. And certainly didn't hurt anything, and came out after I'd been with her 2 or 3 minutes. She was mumbling sort of what had happened, and he said to her, "Miss Conley, the governor is going to be all right. The governor's going to be all right."
That's the first word she had got.
First word she'd heard, and he said, "Thank God." She said, "Oh, thank God." And then she just burst into tears, and I was kind of holding her there. And it turned out he was far more seriously injured than that first report. He was a good deal more seriously injured than that, but they knew they obviously were able to send him out to say he's going to be all right. And that was that.
Did you see Mrs. Kennedy?
Never saw another soul. Never saw another soul.
Your reaction when you heard that he was dead, in terms of, did you connect that in any way with, say, the previous activities in Dallas, the right-wing element?
Never thought of it in those terms. What actually happened was Lyndon Johnson was rushed, as you know, to the plane, to Air Force One. On his way there, or when he got to the plane, I think on the way there, he called my law office. My law partner, the late Judge Irving L. Goldberg, was Johnson's close friend, closer to him than I was, I guess, and sort of his lawyer to some extent, good friend. And they reached Goldberg, and the president said, "Who should swear me in, Irving?" And Irv said, "Well, you don't need to be sworn in." He was a better lawyer than I was. I would have known that. He said, "You are president, but I think you ought to be sworn in for ceremonial purposes, and it ought to happen here. So when you land, the ceremonial activities will have taken place, and the public will know the president has arrived. And,
Back in Washington.
Back in Washington. And he said, I'd get Sarah Hughes to do it. She's an appointee of yours. And he then called, I think Irv called Barefoot Sanders, who now is a judge, and asked him to help him find Sarah Hughes, and they sent her out there. And that's how she came to be the one who swore him in. So we were right in the middle of all that activity.
Were you there for the swearing in on Air Force One?
No, I was not. I was at the hospital with John Conley.
Well, I see you stayed with the Conley.
Exactly. Then I called Helen, I remember, from the hospital, and I said, honey, you better go get 50, 60 steaks. I remember saying something like that, and where we can put them on the grill tonight. And be sure we have plenty of beer and plenty of liquor and plenty of soft drinks, because these people are stumbling around here. This was several hours. They're just stumbling around. No one knows where to go or what to do. This was staff and others, and some Kennedy, mostly Johnson and Conley. That night we had, I don't know, 70, 80 people come through our house. The word got around. We told everybody, just come on out and we'll eat at Strauss's. And everybody wanted to be, they kind of wanted to be together, and we just sort of, I guess it was an Irish wake in a Jewish home, because we drank a lot of whiskey and fixed steaks, and people sat around until well after midnight talking and telling stories about Kennedy and Johnson and politics, Conley, you know, all that.
That would be a wake.
That was just what it was.
You've told us several things we've never heard before here, and I expected that. You told me yesterday that there were some things nobody else had ever heard.
Well, people didn't know about those discussions between Kennedy and Conley leading up to the trip. That's never really been told in detail. Now, if you go back and look in a Life magazine piece, Conley asked me some months after this. Matter of fact, when Conley was well enough to travel, he was still bandaged. He called and said, I want to go to Washington and I want to go to New York. And Time magazine is offered a plane. They want to have a reception up there. So let's go to New York. And Helen and I joined the Conleys, and we went to New York and spent 2 or 3 days. And wherever we would go, of course, we went to theater and did things. It was a pleasure trip. It wasn't a working trip. And he was in that bandage, and I used to kid him about, Conley, I know you could take off that bandage, but don't take it off till we get through this trip, because it sure gets us good service. And we laughed about that.
He was still in the sling?
He was still in the sling, yeah. But everywhere he went, of course, and on the street, people would stop and applaud when he went by. Then everyone had seen his face, and he had that bandage. And then we went by Washington, and we saw the Johnsons, and that was the first time Johnson and Conley had been together, and any problems they had, they patched up.
Let's go back to that visit in your house, the night of, that was the night of the assassination.
Yes.
We all know that there was such tremendous anti-Dallas and anti-Texas talk after the days of the assassination. Did you see any of that night under those circumstances?
No, because there was nobody in the Dallas community was there. These were out-of-town people.
But those are the ones that seem to be most critical of Dallas.
I don't think that was necessarily true. No, I don't think that was true. No. Matter of fact, a third of those people were Austinites, Texans from Austin, or a third to half of them who were the Conley people in town for that, to work on that or be with the Conleys, and the others there were people who were close to Johnson, people like Warren Woodward and people like that were there. People like John Singleton came up from Houston. He'd kind of been in charge of the Houston thing, but he caught a plane to come up to Dallas, and so these were not the people who would have been critical of Dallas.
Did you see any of that criticism either on your trip to New York with Governor Connolly or later in Washington?
No, only you began to hear it. You were reading it and hearing it. It was a city of hate, and it was terribly overdrawn. The city had nothing to do with that assassination. The climate of hate, to the extent it was here, didn't affect that. That, in my judgment, that assassination was done by a nut who had made up his mind somewhere he was going to assassinate. He wanted to get him, and this trip down here probably triggered it in his mind, but it could have taken place in Chicago or New York or Philadelphia or Los Angeles as well as it did Dallas. Dallas and the political climate in Dallas didn't affect this guy. This guy was a hater and a nut for years, and he could have hated it. He could have been in the First Baptist Church in Dallas leading the choir, or the Temple Emmanuel membership or wherever, and he'd have still been a hater. He was a hater and a sick man, in my judgment.
So you weren't the butt of any anti-Dallas remarks or anything?
No, I had an interesting experience I'll never forget as long as I lived, and it taught me a good lesson. I was getting a haircut a day or two before this assassination, and a Dallas businessman, very well-to-do man, was in the chair next to me. And my barber, a man named Amos, in the old Republic Bank building, was talking to me. Well, he said, I know you're busy, Bob. You know your name's in the paper because you're helping with this, planning this thing, and with the President Kennedy coming down, Miss Kennedy being down, and we talked about it. And then he said something about Kennedy, and this fellow said, I hope they kill the son of a bitch.
This was a prominent businessman?
Yeah, sitting in the next chair. And I just bit my tongue and went on talking to Amos. And it annoyed me, but I didn't pay any attention to him. I knew him to be a hardliner, and he wasn't particularly a friend of mine. He's an acquaintance of mine I used to see. And a couple of days after that assassination, about 3 days after, he called me and was, if he wasn't crying, maybe it was a day or two after it, he was almost crying, and said, Bob, I hope I haven't slept since this assassination, and I remember my remark to you, and I haven't slept since. I hope you know I didn't mean that. It was just a stupid temper statement, and I hope you know I didn't mean it, and you'll forgive me and not repeat it. And I said, I haven't repeated it, and I certainly wouldn't, and I know you didn't mean it, and I know he didn't mean it. It's just an intemperate remark, and it's a good lesson.
Did you attend the funeral of President Kennedy in Washington?
I'm just trying to remember. No. I don't think I did.
Did Conway ever talk to you about, you know, you're well aware there's all kind of theories about out there who's involved in this, all this, about the theory that began really right away, I think, after that he was the target as opposed to...
Well, we talked about that, and he certainly talked about the fact he thought could have been more than one person, and that he'd heard these shots, and he wasn't clear where they came from. And Nellie Connolly has spoken out on that a great deal, and so has he, and the records are full of it, and I don't want to comment on it because I don't remember it in detail.
Representatives of labor unions as well as of the professions and of the large businesses. We had black and Hispanic representatives there as well, and we tried to create a good cross-section of the civic leadership of our community. But even so, gosh, in those days it was rare when the President of the United States was in your town, your hometown. There had not been a sitting president in Fort Worth since 1936, when Franklin D. Roosevelt had taken a ride down Main Street in an open touring car. I was there as a boy. I had stood on the sidelines and seen him, waved and just walking on cloud nine simply to get a glimpse of the president. I knew there were thousands of people, plain people, ordinary folks who loved John F. Kennedy, whose president he was, many of whom had worked in his campaign, many of whom had done the mundane, thankless tasks of wearing out their shoe leather and knocking on doors and helping him to carry Texas, which he and Johnson had done, who would love to see the president. So I imposed upon the others, and I said, look, in my hometown, I want a public meeting. I want a meeting out there. We can go right outside the Texas Hotel where he'll be spending the night. We will assemble the crowd in that big parking lot out there. In those days, before they had built the park, which now commemorates that tragic day, there was ample space for maybe 8,000, 10,000 people crowded out into the streets in all directions, maybe more. And they were crowded. I want everybody to be able to come. Folks who have to punch a clock, let's say at 8 o'clock, they could be there at 7. So we set an early morning appearance, to which Kennedy readily agreed. Boy, the night before, it rained. I awakened at about 4:30 and a patter of raindrops. I couldn't go back to sleep. Every 10 minutes, I'd go over to the window to look out. I was staying at the hotel, so I was to be there to get the president and take him out to meet the crowd. Rain was still falling. Finally, at about 15 minutes before he was scheduled to appear, I looked out and people were already gathering in rain gear, some with their umbrellas, many with umbrellas. And I thought, oh, what a mess, what a tragedy. I've got the president. What have I got him into? He's got to get up on that flatbed trailer and speak to that crowd in the rain. 15 minutes before we went out there, clouds disappeared, the sun came through, bright, beautiful, sunshiny day, rain disappeared. I thought, the luck of the Irish. So I went by to get him, and we all went out. There's a picture here of the day.
Appropriate time to show some of those
all
photographs,
right.
I think.
Here we were walking outside, out of the hotel. There's Lyndon Johnson and Ralph Yarborough, and State Senator Don Kennard and I. All right.
Is that okay, Bob?
Yeah, that's fine.
And let's go ahead and point them out.
Tilt the top
right.
toward me a little bit. That's good.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Is that
there
all
was
right?
a reflection on it.
Here's
Now point out the picture.
Senator Yarborough and I, President Kennedy, of course, Governor Connolly, Vice President Johnson. This is Rufus Youngblood, be received in Dallas. I didn't have any question how warmly he would be received in Fort Worth. But I wondered about Dallas. I needn't have. God, it was wonderful. It was gracious. It was warm. When he did get there, I know I'm getting ahead of the story.
Okay. No, that's okay. We're there now.
By the time we got to Dallas, and he opted for this open touring car, Secret Service tried to convince him to use a bubble-top limousine, which they had prepared for him there because of the safety precautions, security. He turned it down. John F. Kennedy made the judgment.
Did you hear this?
Yes, yes. He wanted to demonstrate his confidence and his faith in the people of Dallas and to be part of them, to share with them, to see them, to be seen by them, to look in their eyes, to wave at them. I don't know, we were in the 5th or 6th car back in Dallas, behind the press bus and press cameraman. Jack Brooks and Earl Cabell and I believe, were in this car together.
Earl Cabell, then mayor of Dallas.
Then, having been mayor, yes, then mayor of Dallas.
Yes.
I believe that is correct. Yeah, it surely is. We were just overjoyed by the marvelously hospitable turnout of people all the way from Love Field, all the way in through the city streets, down Main Street, and then when we turned there at the courthouse, going north, we were in such a good mood. I heard the first shot. I thought it sounded like a rifle shot, but I couldn't imagine. So in Congress, to me, was the idea that there'd be a rifle shot. Then I heard the second shot. And I thought, it was crazy. Someone is trying to fire a 21-gun salute with a rifle. It was obviously a rifle shot. And obviously the shots were from the same rifle. Anybody who's hunted knows how to recognize the sound of a rifle. And then the third shot came.
You
The cadence.
distinctly heard these three shots?
Yes. I distinctly heard 3 shots. That's all I heard. Now, this is not to say there couldn't have been some other gun with a silencer. I don't know that. I'm not authoritative on that. But I must say the audible shots were 3, and they were from the same rifle. Same rifle. But the timing of the third, the cadence, was just off a fraction of a second, enough to let me know, uh-oh, no, this isn't a salute. And then there was pandemonium as we turned heading west and past that. We looked and saw pandemonium in the cars, and Jacqueline Kennedy on her knees in the back seat, looking out behind, and we couldn't imagine what was happening. Then the car shot forward. Immediately after that, the car in which the Vice President had been riding shot forward, and as we picked up speed to follow in train. As we passed the crowd on the grassy knoll, I wasn't a captain, hardly even a lieutenant. I might have been a private in the rear ranks, a congressman with, how many, 4 terms under his belt. But I was a joyous part of, joyful part of President Kennedy's team. I believed in such things as the Peace Corps and the Job Corps and the other things that Kennedy had launched. I wanted to be a part of bringing them to pass. And when I was told that he was contemplating a trip to Texas in November of, I guess I was told 6 weeks earlier, I got together with all the people who would be involved. We planned the itinerary in such a way that he would go to San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, Austin. He was in Fort Worth the last night of his life, and of course made his last 2 speeches here in Fort Worth. My job was to do 2 things. First, to arrange the itinerary for Fort Worth, and secondly, to try to help John Connally raise enough money for the big fundraiser that was to be held on the night of November 22nd in Austin. Fundraising never had been my forte, and never was all the time I stayed in Congress. I didn't enjoy it. To me, fundraising was the crabgrass in the lawn of political life. I didn't like it. Hated to ask people for money. Connally was a little more practical than I. He said, Jim, this is the purpose. We've got to have some money, as you know, to conduct a viable campaign next year. And I want you to help me raise $100,000 out of North Central and West Texas. So I got on the phone. I got together with some people in little groups and meetings, and I think probably I raised maybe $87,000, which in that time was a substantial amount of money. I was working on the $100,000. I'm not sure that I made that. I think that was my quota, and I'm not sure that I fulfilled it. However, I insisted, this was my insistence, that we have a meeting outside early in the morning, before the meeting of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce group in the Texas Hotel on the mezzanine floor in the big ballroom, those tickets, of course, were limited. The seating it was a big ballroom, but even so, you could accommodate only so many people. And I carefully worked with Raymond Buck, who was my friend and president of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. And by this time, Amon Carter Jr. was a good friend of mine. And I worked with what powers that be in Fort Worth to put on a good, effective breakfast meeting of the civic, business, and commercial leadership of the community. We integrated it. We had more, of course, on the route from Fort Worth over to Dallas. President Kennedy really was absorbed with the consuming interest in how these two cities, Fort Worth and Dallas, so close together, were yet so utterly different in personality and in makeup.
And you and he discussed this?
Oh, yes. He and I and John Connolly had a discussion on Air Force One from Fort Worth over to Dallas that morning of November 22nd. There had appeared in the Dallas News that morning a scurrilous ad calling him a traitor and other unflattering things.
He had seen that.
Yes, he had seen that. And I was irate. I thought it was a damned inhospitable thing to allow, that the paper should have screened it out. I don't know what I was writing on, but
How did he approach you on that? I mean, did he...
he didn't approach me. I don't remember how the subject came up, but he was puzzled as to how to approach the Dallas News, how to be friends with them. They had written other unkind things. Mr. Dealey had written an unkind editorial about him, saying he ought to be riding Carolyn's tricycle or something like that. And we were trying to describe to him the different cultural history of our two towns. That Fort Worth was more of a blue-collar town, founded on cattle, wheat, cotton, railroads. That Dallas was a white-collar town, founded on banks, insurance companies, things of that sort. And I think he was fascinated by the comparison of the two. And I'm not sure if John and I were sociologists enough to give him a good understanding, but we did the best we could.
John Connolly, you mean?
Yeah. We did the best we could. I suppose that was the happiest and the saddest day of my life.
Let me,
up to
before
that
we
time.
get to that, but let's go back to the Air Force One trip from Washington down.
Yeah.
Was there anticipation? Was there some consideration? You know, Adlai Stevenson had been attacked in Dallas about 1 month before. Was that discussed either among the news people or among your colleagues? Or?
Wes, I can't say what may have been discussed among the news people because I really didn't have that much access to them. I was not a prime target of their queries until they started for Fort Worth, and then they peppered me with a multitude of questions about Fort Worth, our plans for the presidential visit. So I don't know what was in their minds. It was not a matter of great apprehension on our part. I had been with Johnson and Kennedy on the day he had visited Fort Worth and Dallas in the 1960 campaign, had ridden in the parade midday through Dallas, deliberately timed for the noon hour so as to get a big overflow of people out there. And I had seen that there was not a lot of applause, not a lot of smiles.
You're talking 1960.
1960.
Right.
And I had some personal question in my mind as to how warmly he might, the Secret Service man who threw himself over Lyndon Johnson's body when the shots came, and these here, another Secret Service man here, and our crowd moved out of the hotel out to a big crowd that was waiting for us in the parking lot.
Welcome to Fort Worth.
Welcome to Fort Worth, yeah.
The Side there, spoke up.
We see it.
We came out there, and what a crowd it was.
Yeah.
There's one picture of the crowd
Right over here too.
looking in one direction while the president is speaking.
There's still some umbrellas up over here.
Oh yeah. Here is another picture shown from another vantage point. You can see people crowding the streets right up against the corners of the buildings across the streets in this direction.
Here you are. Here's Speaker Wright, right? Right. That's you, is it not?
That young and tender-looking guy with the bushy eyebrows is I. Here's a kind of a close-up of that picture. I was so happy. I can't tell you how ebullient I was to have the President of the United States in my hometown talking to my constituents, my folks. I was just overcome with joy. Here he spoke. This is probably as good a picture of...
Is the glare okay, Bob?
Yes.
Here's President Kennedy speaking. Raymond Buck, who was the president of the Chamber of Commerce. Here I am. Senator Yarborough, Governor Connolly, President Johnson, the Secret Service man, ubiquitously down front, scanning the crowd. No foolishness to him. All serious business. This was a State Democratic Executive Committee woman, Mrs. David O. Ballou, Marjorie Ballou. Her husband, David, later became federal district judge some 15 or more years later. These were happy days. This was the night before when they had arrived at Carswell Air Force Base. You can see it's dark, and someone had a bouquet of roses to give to Jacqueline Kennedy. Those were yellow roses, and she took them and had them with her that night in the hotel. You see here Governor Connolly and Nellie Connolly,
There you are.
There I am, Ralph Yarborough. Back here is Graham Purcell, Congressman from Wichita Falls, who was with us that day. Here is David Ballou, whom I mentioned, later federal judge. Over here in the corner is Albert Thomas. The evening just before we left Houston, we had dedicated a federal building in his honor in Houston, Texas, and the president had spoken there.
Go ahead, Bob.
You started with the party in '63, coming to Texas in Washington.
Yes.
Okay.
You were on Air Force One.
Yes, along with others in our delegation. There were a number of us who left Washington on Air Force One to fly to Texas the previous day on November 21st.
What was the feeling? What was the atmosphere coming to Texas? Did you get to talk to President Kennedy during that trip?
Yes, oh gosh, yes. I talked with him